A Thursday evening, perfectly still. No streetlight, no signal, no sound for miles. The kind of place men like him don't notice, don't need, don't even remember exists. And yet, at the end of a gravel path in a town so small it didn't appear on any map that mattered, the most dangerous man in 4 states stood staring at a house that had no business existing in his world. He hadn't moved in minutes. The house was modest, paint fading at the edges, a garden out front that someone tended with patience he had never understood. Lavender grew along the fence line. Toys sat on the porch, small, scattered, belonging to hands too little to put things away. His chest tightened in a way it hadn't in years. Not from danger, not from control, from something he didn't have a word for. Light moved behind the curtains. Warm, golden, the glow of a lantern, something that didn't rely on the same systems the rest of the world depended on. The door opened before he could decide whether to knock. She stood in the frame, one hand on the wood, the other resting on the shoulder of a small girl pressed against her leg. The child was maybe 4, barefoot on the cool wood of the porch, wearing a shirt too large for her that hung past her knees, dark hair pulled into a loose braid. Still watchful, studying him the way someone watches a storm they haven't decided to be afraid of yet. Then the girl looked up. His breath stopped. Green. Deep, sharp, unmistakable green. His eyes in a face that was entirely hers. The world didn't tilt. It cracked. Clean and absolute, like glass struck at exactly the right pressure point. Everything he thought he understood about the last 4 years collapsed in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Sovana. Her name came out like something pulled from the bottom of a river. Heavy, waterlogged, carrying the weight of every day he had spent not knowing where she was. She didn't flinch, didn't soften. Her expression held firm, carved from something harder than he remembered, shaped by years he hadn't been allowed to witness. Her hand on the girl's shoulder tightened just slightly. Not fear, protection. Instinctive, immediate, total. "You need to leave," she said. The words were calm, measured, like she had practiced them so many times they no longer carried feeling. But he heard it underneath. The faintest crack, thin as thread, buried beneath everything she had built to keep herself standing. The girl tilted her head. "Mama, who is he?" Something inside him fractured so deeply he wasn't sure it would ever close again. Sovana's gaze didn't leave his. "No one, Vesna, go inside." But he's just standing there. Inside, now. The girl hesitated, studying him one more time with those green eyes that held the same sharpness, the same unnerving stillness that had made grown men look away from him for the last 15 years. Then she turned and disappeared into the house, her small feet padding softly against the floor. The door started to close. "Sovana, wait. There is nothing to wait for." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Every word landed with the weight of years, of silence, of choices he hadn't been there to understand. "I didn't know." His throat closed around the words. "I swear to you I didn't know." Her eyes flickered. Just once. Just enough to tell him that whatever wall she had built was not as solid as she needed it to be. But it held. 4 years, she said. 4 years, Hadion. You don't get to stand on my porch and say you didn't know. I looked for you. Every single day You found me." The words fell like stones. "Now leave. The way you should have left the first time." The door closed. Not a slam. Something worse. A slow, deliberate pull of wood against frame, like she was sealing something she never intended to open again. The lock turned with a sound so small it shouldn't have mattered. But it echoed through him louder than anything he had ever heard. He stood there. Rain hadn't come yet, but the air was heavy with it, pressing against his skin, filling his lungs with something thick that made breathing feel like effort. His hands hung at his sides, fingers curling and uncurling around nothing. He should leave. Any man with sense would walk back to the car and drive, until this town became nothing but a memory. But he wasn't that man. Not anymore. Not since the night the lights went out and a woman with no reason to trust anyone opened her door to a stranger bleeding on her steps. He lowered himself onto the porch. The wood groaned under his weight. He rested his elbows on his knees, clasped his hands together, and stared at the closed door like it was the only thing left in the world worth looking at. Inside, the girl's voice carried through the wood, muffled but clear enough to reach him. "Mama, why does he look like me?" Silence. Long, painful, full of something he would never be allowed to hear. Then, Sovana's voice, tighter than before, pulled thin in a way that made his chest ache. "He doesn't, baby. Go wash your hands for dinner." But she was wrong. And they both knew it. Outside, the man who had built an empire on fear and precision lowered his head and stayed, because for the first time in 4 years he had found the one thing no amount of power could replace. And he was not leaving until she understood why. The night the world went dark began without warning. One moment the city hummed with light and noise and motion, and the next, silence. Every streetlight, every window, every screen blinked once and went black. The entire grid collapsed in a single breath, and the city became something unrecognizable, still, blind, afraid. I was alone in my apartment, third floor of an old building on the east side where the walls were thin and the radiator spoke in languages no one understood. I lit candles, set them along the counter, and told myself it was temporary. Morning would fix everything. It always did. Then the knock came. 3 slow strikes, spaced unevenly, like the person on the other side wasn't sure they had strength for a fourth. Then a sound that made the decision for me. A body sliding down the door, settling against the frame with the weight of surrender. I opened it. He was on the ground, half collapsed against my doorframe. Dark coat soaked through with something that caught the candlelight and glistened too thick to be rain. Blood. Across his side, seeping through his shirt, pooling beneath the hand he pressed against his ribs like he could hold himself together through sheer will. His face lifted, sharp features tight with pain, jaw clenched, eyes green in a way that didn't ask for attention but took it anyway. "I need help." Low, rough, honest, no pretense. Just a man bleeding on a stranger's doorstep in a city that had gone dark. I should have closed the door. A bleeding stranger in a blackout was not safety. But his eyes held something I recognized. Not danger, exhaustion. The look of someone who had run out of places to go. I pulled his arm over my shoulder and brought him inside. Cleaned the wound with warm water and hands that surprised me with how little they shook. The cut was deep but not fatal, a clean slice across his ribs that needed pressure and patience, not surgery. He watched me the entire time with an intensity that should have unsettled me but didn't. "You're not afraid," he said after a while. "Not a question." "I'm terrified," I told him without looking up. "But that doesn't change what needs to be done." Something moved behind his eyes, something I wouldn't understand until much later. Like I had said something no one had ever said to him before, not because it was remarkable, because it was true. The blackout held for 2 days. We existed in candlelight and conversation, talking about small things that slowly became less small. He asked about the photograph on my shelf, the one of a man with kind eyes and my same dark hair. My father, I told him, gone since I was 17. His expression changed when I said it, just slightly. Just enough to notice, but not enough to understand. He told me nothing about himself. Not his name, not his work, not the reason for the blade. I didn't press. On the second morning, the lights came back. The world we had shared began to dissolve. He stood near my door, moving with care that told me the wound still pulled with every breath. "Thank you," he said, watching me in a way that felt heavier than 2 words should allow. "You don't need to thank me. Anyone would have done the same." No, certain, unhesitating. They wouldn't. He left without giving me his name. I didn't ask for it. The door closed, and the apartment felt larger, emptier, like something had been removed and the space didn't know how to fill itself. I found it 3 days later. A silver lighter tucked between the cushions where he had rested. 2 letters engraved on the back in a design I didn't recognize. I should have thrown it away. Instead, something pulled at me, some instinct I couldn't silence. The search took less than an hour. His face filled my screen. Sharper in the photographs, colder, framed by headlines I had to read 3 times before believing. Hadion Vasic, 15 years of uncontested control across 4 states. A reputation built on silence and fear that never needed to raise its voice. The man I had knelt beside on my kitchen floor. The man whose blood I had washed from my hands. My hands began to shake, not from fear, from recognition. Because beneath the headlines, beneath the territory maps and the surveillance photographs, there was one article, older, buried, dated the year I turned 17. Local journalist found dead in connection with organized crime investigation. I didn't need to finish reading. I had lived the rest. Every birthday without him, every empty chair at the table, every night wondering what my father had done to deserve what happened to him. The lighter fell from my hands and hit the floor. The man I had saved was the reason I had no one left to save me. And somewhere beneath my ribs, in a place I had not allowed anyone to reach in years, something tore open. Not grief, not anger, something worse. The realization that for 2 days in the dark, I had felt safe with the man who destroyed my world. And I had meant it. That was the part I could not forgive. I did not panic. Panic is loud, visible, a reaction that leaves trails for people who know how to follow them. And men like Hadion Vasic always had people who knew how to follow. I sat on the floor for 1 hour, the lighter in one hand, phone in the other, his face on my screen beside the one I had memorized in candlelight. The same jaw, the same eyes, the same hands that had rested at his sides while I pressed cloth to his wound and told him to breathe. The same hands that had signed orders, moved pieces, decided who lived and who didn't. When the hour ended, I stood, my legs held. My mind was sharp, not calm but focused, a clarity that arrives only when you realize the only person who can protect you is yourself. I packed 1 bag. Not everything, not even most of it, just what mattered. 2 changes of clothes, the photograph of my father, cash from the envelope taped behind the bathroom mirror, savings from years of small amounts set aside without knowing why. Now I knew. I left the candles on the counter, left the dishes in the sink, left the apartment looking like someone who planned to return, because that was the smartest thing I could do. Disappearance is not about leaving, it is about making it look like you haven't. The city was still recovering from the blackout. Some lights had returned, others flickered uncertainly. People moved through the evening with the cautious energy of those who had been shaken. No one noticed one more woman with a bag over her shoulder moving through streets that had bigger problems. I walked to the bus station 6 blocks east. Not a train, not a cab, nothing that left a record. Buses carried people who paid in crumpled bills and chose seats where no questions reached them. I bought a ticket to the furthest destination on the board, a name I had never heard, in a direction I had never traveled, far enough that the name Hadion Vasic might mean nothing to anyone. The bus pulled away and the city shrank behind me, its skyline dimming like something letting go. I watched it disappear the way you watch a door close on a room you know you will never enter again. The bus drove through the night. I didn't sleep. I sat with my father's photograph pressed between my fingers, watching the road vanish mile by mile until the city was nothing but a memory, and the world outside became fields and trees and darkness that asked nothing of me. Somewhere past midnight, a thought surfaced that I tried to push down but couldn't. He had looked at my father's photograph. He had seen the face. He had listened to me say the words "gone" since I was 17, and his expression had changed. Not surprise, not confusion, recognition. He had known. Sitting in my apartment, wrapped in my blankets, held together by my hands, he had known exactly whose daughter I was. And he had said nothing. That silence was worse than any confession, because it meant even bleeding on my floor, even looking at me with those eyes that felt honest, he had been calculating, choosing what to reveal and what to bury. I pressed my forehead against the cold glass and let the vibration of the engine fill the spaces where feeling would have gone if I had allowed it. But I didn't. Feeling was a luxury I no longer owned. All I had was distance. And I intended to put as much of it between us as the world would allow. The bus left me at the edge of a town called Coppervale just after sunrise on the 3rd day. I didn't choose it. My body chose it for me. My legs wouldn't carry me any further. And when the driver called out the stop and I saw the way morning light settled against the hills, something inside me went still. Not peaceful, just done. Coppervale looked like a place the rest of the world had agreed to forget. A single main road lined with buildings that leaned slightly toward each other like old friends mid-conversation. A hardware store with rocking chairs out front that no one seemed to own but everyone used. Mountains rising on three sides like walls built by something older and more patient than any man. No cameras, no black cars, no one watching from doorways. Just people who moved at the speed of the seasons and measured their days by the height of the sun. I stood at the edge of town for a long time, my bag pulling at my shoulder, my body carrying an exhaustion that sleep alone cannot fix. I waited for someone to look too closely, for someone to recognize something in my face that didn't belong here. No one did. The greenhouse found me before I found it. Set back from the main road behind a low stone wall, its glass panels catching the early light in a way that made the whole structure glow from within. The smell reached me first. Earth, green things growing, moisture in the air. A warmth that has nothing to do with temperature, and everything to do with life continuing without anyone's permission. The woman inside was standing between rows of seedlings when I walked through the door. She was older, silver hair cut short and practical, her hands dark with soil up to the wrists. She looked at me once, taking her time, reading what I carried without asking me to say it out loud. "Looking for work?" she asked. No greeting first, no small talk. Just the question that mattered. "Yes." She nodded toward a row of empty clay pots. "I open at 7. Be here at 6 if you want to keep it. The cottage out back has a bed and a door that locks. Rent comes out of your first month." Her name was Dagny. She didn't ask for mine, and I didn't offer one that was real. I gave her a name I had never used before. Something simple, something forgettable, and something that would never appear in any record connected to who I had been. The cottage was barely larger than my old apartment's kitchen. A bed against one wall, a chair near the window, a sink that ran cold water, and nothing else. But when I closed the door behind me and heard the lock catch, something loosened inside my chest. Not relief, not safety. Just the smallest release of a knot I had been carrying since the night I found that lighter between my cushions. I worked mornings in the greenhouse, learning the rhythm of soil and water and patience. Dagny spoke rarely, and never about anything that didn't matter. She taught me how to read the color of a leaf, how to feel when roots had taken hold, how to know when something was ready to survive on its own. I kept my head down, my voice low, my past buried so deep it might as well have been planted alongside the seeds I pressed into dark earth every morning. At night, I lay in the narrow bed and listened to the silence of a town that slept without fear, counting my breaths like proof that I had made it through another day without being found. The silence should have been comforting. It wasn't. It felt like something holding its breath. The sickness came without warning. It started on a morning 3 weeks after I arrived. A sudden wave of nausea that hit while I was repotting lavender in the back row of the greenhouse. Sharp, immediate, strong enough to make me grip the edge of the table and close my eyes until the world stopped tilting. I told myself it was exhaustion. Stress catching up to a body that had been running on adrenaline and distance for weeks. The kind of thing that passes if you ignore it long enough. But it didn't pass. It returned the next morning, and the morning after that, arriving with a reliability that mocked every explanation I tried to give it. Dizziness followed, then a heaviness in my limbs that had nothing to do with work, and everything to do with something I was not ready to face. Dagny noticed before I said anything. She watched me one morning as I braced myself against the doorframe, her sharp eyes tracking the way my hand moved instinctively to my stomach before I caught myself and pulled it away. She didn't ask. She simply set a glass of water on the table and said, "There's a clinic on Barrow Street. The woman who runs it doesn't talk." I almost didn't go. Almost convinced myself that willpower alone could make it untrue. But survival is not about denying what is happening to you. It is about facing it before it consumes you. The clinic was small, tucked between a laundromat and a feed store. The woman inside was calm, unhurried, with careful hands and a voice that carried no judgment. The test took minutes. The result took less. "You're pregnant," she said, watching my face the way someone watches glass to see if it will hold or shatter. It held. Barely. My mind tried to reject it, tried to push the words into a space where they didn't connect to anything real, but they connected to everything. To the blackout, to the candlelight, to 2 days in a dark apartment with a man whose hands I had held while cleaning a wound that should have meant nothing. "How far along?" My voice didn't sound like mine. "Several weeks. We'll confirm with further tests." I walked back to the cottage, through streets that looked the same as they had an hour before, but felt entirely different. I was no longer just hiding. I was no longer just surviving. I was carrying his child. The thought hit me in the middle of the road, sudden and total, like a crack spreading through a frozen lake. I stopped walking, my hand pressed flat against my stomach. My breath caught on something sharp that was not quite fear and not quite grief, but lived somewhere between the two. Everything I had done to disappear, every mile I had put between myself and the man whose name I couldn't speak, none of it mattered now. Because this child would carry his face, his blood, his unmistakable eyes, and if he ever found out, he would not just come for me. He would come for what was his. And men like Hadion Vasic never stopped coming. The lights went out the night she was born. Not the whole city this time. Just Coppervale. Just the small grid that powered a town most of the world had already forgotten. A winter storm rolled through the mountains without warning, pulling down power lines and burying roads under a silence so heavy it felt deliberate, like the universe was repeating itself, like it wanted me to remember where all of this began. I was not supposed to deliver that night. The doctor at the clinic had said I had weeks remaining, time to prepare, time to figure out how I was going to raise a child alone in a town where no one even knew my real name. But this child, like everything else that had come after that blackout, did not wait for permission. The first contraction hit while I was locking the greenhouse door. It tore through me so sharply I grabbed the frame and bent forward, my breath escaping in a rush that left nothing behind. I told myself it would pass, that it was too early, that my body was reacting to the cold, the storm, the stress I carried in every muscle like a second skeleton. By the third, I couldn't lie to myself anymore. Dagny found me before I reached the road. She didn't ask what was happening. She took my arm, walked me to her truck, and drove through a storm that bent the trees sideways and turned the world into something made entirely of wind and white. The clinic was running on a backup generator when we arrived. Dim lights flickering once, twice, then holding just enough to feel like a promise the building wasn't sure it could keep. The doctor moved quickly, her hands and voice the only anchors in a night that refused to slow down. And then, between one breath and the next, there was a sound that did not belong to the storm. A cry. Small but fierce, cutting through the wind and the darkness, and every wall I had built around myself for the past 8 months. A girl. They placed her on my chest, still trembling with the shock of existing, her tiny body curling instinctively against mine, like she had always known where she belonged. I looked at her face and felt everything I had buried rise to the surface in a single devastating wave. She was beautiful, small and serious, with dark hair that clung to her forehead and skin flushed pink from the effort of arriving. Her fingers gripped my shirt with a strength that should not have existed in something so new, so fragile, and so completely unprepared for the world she had just entered. Then she opened her eyes. Green. Deep. Sharp. Unmistakable. His eyes. My breath left me in a way that had nothing to do with exhaustion and everything to do with the man I had spent 8 months trying to erase from my existence. He was there, looking up at me from a face that was otherwise entirely mine, present in the one detail that could never be hidden, never be explained away, and never be denied. Dagny stood near the door, understanding more than she would ever say out loud. I held my daughter closer, her heartbeat against mine, her breath warm against my neck. Outside, the storm tore through the valley, but inside that small room, with the generator humming and the lights barely holding on, something was being built that no storm could touch. I named her Vesna. It means spring. The season that comes after everything has been frozen and buried and given up for dead. The season that proves survival is not the end of the story but the beginning of a different one. Vesna, my daughter, my reason to stop running and start building. Because running keeps you alive, but it doesn't give you a life. And she deserved a life, even if that life had to be hidden, even if the man whose eyes she carried could never know she existed. Because if he ever found out, he would not see a child. He would see a claim, and men who build empires do not walk away from what belongs to them. He did not begin searching the night she disappeared. That would suggest he noticed immediately. And men who control what he controlled do not keep track of strangers who clean their wounds and ask for nothing in return. In his world, kindness is a transaction, and the woman in the apartment on the east side had refused to make it one. That was the first thing that stayed with him. He returned to his life the way a man steps back into armor. Meetings resumed, orders were given. But something had come loose, something small and persistent, like a stone caught in the machinery of a clock. Everything still moved, but nothing kept proper time. He thought of her in moments he didn't expect, not during the violent ones, during the pauses. The seconds before sleep that now carried the faint memory of candlelight and a voice that said, "I'm terrified." But that doesn't change what needs to be done. No one had ever spoken to him like that, not once in 15 years. He sent someone to find her. Not urgently, just a name checked, an address visited. The report came back within the week. Gone, apartment empty, no forwarding address, no trail. He went himself, stood in the doorway of her empty apartment. Candle wax on the counter, the faint smell of soap, the shelf where her father's photograph had been, now bare. Her father. The memory surfaced with a sharpness that made him go still. The kind eyes, the dark hair that matched hers. Gone since I was 17. And his own reaction, the one he had controlled but not quickly enough. He had recognized that face. Not personally, not as someone he had known, but as a name that had crossed his desk years ago, a casualty listed in a report he had not ordered and had not questioned closely enough. She hadn't just left, she had run, and she had run because of him. The search hollowed out every other priority. He traced her path to the bus station, the ticket heading east into territory so far removed from his influence it barely registered on any map he controlled. But during the search, something else broke open, something he had not been looking for. The inquiry into her father's death led backward through records he had trusted without question. The journalist, Miro Telak, had been investigating operations in the Eastern District, territory managed not by Hadion directly but by his most trusted lieutenant, a man named Levon Sarah, who had been at his side for over a decade, who handled logistics and kept the machinery running, who carried the particular stillness of a man with secrets he had learned never to disturb, payments that didn't align with authorized operations, communications routed through channels Hadion had never approved, a network within his own empire siphoning control for years, operating like rot in a foundation that still appeared solid from the outside. The journalist had gotten close enough that Levon decided he needed to disappear. The order was given in Hadion's name, using his authority, but it had never come from him. And then a second connection, sharper, more immediate. The night of the blackout, the blade between his ribs. He had assumed it was a rival making a move in the chaos, but it had not been a rival. The man who sent someone to kill him that night was the same man who had killed her father 5 years before, Levon Sarah. The same lieutenant who attended meetings the following morning with concerned eyes and careful words, performing loyalty so convincingly it had never once been questioned, until now. Hadion did not react with speed, he reacted with precision. Men were pulled from positions, questioned in rooms where answers mattered more than comfort. Records unsealed, communications decrypted, alliances tested until they broke or held. Levon did not run. He didn't know he needed to. That was the advantage of trust. It blinds the person who abuses it most. When the end came, it was without spectacle, just absence. Levon Sarah stopped existing the same way Savannah's father had, completely, permanently, without anything left behind to question. But erasing the traitor did not erase the truth. She had sheltered him, held his wound closed, looked into his eyes across candlelight, and then discovered that the man she saved was the man she had every reason to destroy. And she had been wrong. But she didn't know that. She had built an entire life on a lie someone else had constructed, running from a man who had never given the order she believed he had. That realization did not bring relief. It brought something far more dangerous: direction. Because somewhere, in a place too small to matter, she was living a life built on the certainty that he was a monster. And if he ever wanted to undo that, he would have to find her first. And this time, he would not send anyone else. It did not happen because of luck. It happened because of a photograph, the kind that should have meant nothing to anyone outside a town no one had ever heard of. A community newspaper, printed monthly on cheap paper and distributed to fewer than 300 residents, had been digitized by a volunteer librarian who believed small towns deserved to exist on the internet. Most of the images were unremarkable: a harvest festival, a school fundraiser, vendor tables with handmade goods, background noise to anyone scrolling past. But in one photograph, taken at the Coppervale Spring Market, a woman stood behind a table covered in potted herbs and cut flowers. She was not the subject of the image. She was off to the side, half turned, and her dark hair pulled back, her face caught in profile by sunlight that had no idea what it was revealing. The man assigned to monitor digital traces almost scrolled past it. Almost. But something caught, the way a thread snags on a rough surface, small and easy to miss unless you were paying the kind of attention that 4 years of searching had made permanent. The image arrived on Hadion's screen without comment. None was needed. He stared at it longer than any man who claimed control would allow himself. The resolution was poor, the angle imperfect, but it was enough. 4 years. 4 years of dismantling rot inside his own empire, of waking in rooms that still carried the memory of candlelight. And here she was, not hidden in shadow, but standing in open sunlight at a market in a town so small the road to reach it probably disappeared in winter. His first instinct was to send men, but something stopped him. 4 years had taught him that sending others meant delay. Delay meant time for her to hear unfamiliar footsteps and vanish again. He could not survive her vanishing again. He drove alone. 6 hours through roads that thinned from highways to gravel paths winding through mountains like afterthoughts. The city shrank behind him, and the world ahead became something untouched by anything that answered to his name. Coppervale arrived without announcement. A bend in the road, a cluster of roofs, and a faded sign suggesting the place had stopped introducing itself to strangers long ago. He parked at the edge of town as the sky dimmed toward evening. 4 years of searching had led him here, to a place that should not have mattered. He walked. The greenhouse was the first thing he noticed, glass panels reflecting the last light, a stone wall along the front, the smell of earth drifting through the open door. He followed the path past the greenhouse to the cottage behind it, small, tucked away, a garden with lavender along the fence and toys scattered on the porch. Toys. His chest tightened in a way he did not expect and could not control. Light moved inside the cottage, warm and golden behind thin curtains. He could hear something faint, not voices, just presence. Life happening on the other side of a door he had not yet reached. His hand lifted, paused, and then dropped. He didn't knock, because somehow, standing in a town the world had forgotten, the man who had never been afraid of anything felt something rising in his chest that he could not name. And on the other side of that door, a life was about to change again. Whether she wanted it to or not, he did not leave. That was the first thing Coppervale noticed, though no one said it out loud. Men who carried the kind of weight he carried did not belong in places like this. And yet there he was, sitting on the steps of a cottage that wasn't his, looking like a man who had been told the only door in the world that mattered would not open for him. The morning after she closed the door, he was still there. Rain arrived just after dawn, soaking through his coat and pressing his hair flat against his forehead. He didn't move, didn't seek cover, didn't knock again. He sat with his hands clasped between his knees like patience was the only weapon he had left. Inside, Sovana moved through the cottage with careful precision, doing everything she could to make the morning feel normal when nothing about it was. Vesna sat at the kitchen table, a piece of toast growing cold in front of her. She was observing, watching her mother's movements, reading the tension in her shoulders, measuring the gap between what was being said and what was being felt. "He's still there, Mama." Savannah didn't turn from the counter. "I know. Is he going to stay forever?" The question was too large for a 4-year-old to be asking, and yet Vesna asked it with the same calm directness that made everything she said feel like something being solved rather than feared. "No," Savannah answered. "He'll leave." But even as she said it, something inside her wasn't certain, because the man on her porch was not behaving the way a man like him should. Men with power don't wait, they take, they demand. She had prepared for that version of him. She had rehearsed what to say, how to hold herself, so he would see only walls. But he wasn't pushing against the walls. He was sitting on the other side of them, and that was worse. By midday, Dagny noticed. She stood at the greenhouse door with her arms crossed, watching the figure on the cottage steps with the expression of someone who recognized when something unusual was unfolding. The neighbor from the hardware store walked past and slowed. He studied Hadion, then looked toward Dagny. "Friend of hers?" Dagny's expression didn't change. "That's not for me to say." Inside, Vesna pressed her face to the window, her small fingers leaving prints on the glass. She watched him for a long time, studying the way the rain ran down his face without him wiping it away. "Mama," she said, "he's getting wet." "I know. Can I bring him one of the yellow flowers from the greenhouse?" "Dagny says they make people feel better." The question landed in Sovana's chest like something thrown from a height. Simple, innocent, devastating. The impulse of a child raised on kindness in a town that practiced it like breathing. "No, Vesna." "Why not?" "Because he didn't come here for flowers." Vesna frowned, thinking that over in her serious, measured way. "Then what did he come for?" Sovana closed her eyes for just a second. When she opened them, the composure she relied on was still there, but thinner, worn at the edges. "Something he can't have," she said. Outside, the rain continued. The town moved through its day, and the man on the porch did not move at all. When evening came and the light inside the cottage turned warm and golden, Vesna stood at the window one last time before bed. Her reflection overlapped with the figure outside, two images layered on top of each other in a way that made them look like they belonged in the same frame. "He has my eyes, Mama," she said softly. Not a question, a fact, delivered with the certainty of a child who sees what adults have decided not to. Sovana's breath caught so sharply she had to press her hand against the counter to stay upright. "Time for bed, Vesna." The girl turned from the window slowly, carrying something in her expression that looked far too old for her face. And outside, as if he had somehow felt the words through wood and glass and rain, Hadion lifted his head just slightly. He didn't know what had been said, but something in the air between the cottage and the porch was different now. Something small, something fragile, the first hairline fracture in a wall that had taken 4 years to build. And fractures, once they begin, do not stop on their own. 3 days passed before she spoke to him again. The evening had grown cooler, the light fading earlier, the town pulling itself indoors as the season turned. Vesna was asleep in the small bed near the window, her breathing slow in the way of children who have not yet learned to carry the things that keep adults awake. Savannah opened the door and stepped onto the porch. He was there, exactly where he had been every day. He looked up when the door opened, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The distance between them felt different now. Not smaller exactly, but less certain, like the ground itself had loosened without either of them moving. "You said you didn't know," she began. Her voice was level, controlled, but no longer frozen. "That first day you said you didn't know. What didn't you know?" He didn't move, didn't try to close the gap, and didn't reach for her in any way that might shatter the fragile balance holding this moment together. "About your father." The words landed like something heavy set down carefully on a surface that might not hold. My father, she repeated, sharper now. The man who was murdered because he got too close to your operation. The man whose photograph you sat beside in my apartment while I told you he was gone. You recognized him, Hadion. I saw it in your face. I recognized the name after you told me, not before. His voice didn't rise. It carried the weight of something said too many times, to people who never believed it. He was a journalist investigating operations in a district I trusted someone else to manage. I didn't order what happened to him. I didn't know until it was too late. That's convenient. It's the truth, and I know how it sounds. She crossed her arms, holding herself together in a way that had become instinct. Then who? He exhaled slowly. A man named Levon Serra. He ran logistics for me for over 10 years. Trusted, dependable, the kind of person you stop watching because you believe they'll never give you a reason to look closely. The name meant nothing to her, but the way he said it meant everything. Your father found financial discrepancies in the Eastern District. He was tracing them to their source, and that source was Levon. So Levon gave the order, used my name, used my authority, made it look like it came from the top so no one would ever question it. Her jaw tightened, not in denial, in the effort of holding everything still while something beneath her gave way. And you never questioned it. I should have. That is the part I cannot undo. His gaze held hers without flinching. I trusted the wrong man, and your father paid for it. That's not an excuse. It is what happened, and I will carry it whether you believe me or not. She searched his face for the lie, the calculation she had trained herself to expect. But his expression held nothing except exhaustion and the kind of honesty that costs something to offer. The night of the blackout, she said slowly. The wound, the blood on your side. He nodded once. Levon. He sent someone to kill me that night. The blackout was his cover. The connection hit her like vertigo. The man who killed her father was the same man who tried to kill Hadion. The same betrayal, the same source, separated by years but grown from the same poison. Where is Levon now? His expression didn't change. Gone. One word. Final. Complete. Silence settled between them, thick with something that was not forgiveness and not anger but harder to name than either. 4 years, she said, her voice lower now. I took your daughter and disappeared for 4 years because I believed you were the one who took my father from me. I know. And you sat on my porch for 3 days knowing that. Yes. Why didn't you just tell me through the door? His gaze softened for the first time since he had arrived in Coppervale. Because the last time someone told you the truth through a closed door, you didn't believe it. I needed you to see my face when I said it. Something gave way inside her, not loudly, not with any display. Just a small, irreversible break in the armor she had spent 4 years reinforcing. Because if he wasn't the man who destroyed her family, then the life she had built in hiding wasn't protection. It was a prison she had constructed out of a lie someone else had told, and she did not yet know how to walk out of it. The weeks that followed moved with a patience that felt deliberate, like the world itself had decided to give them time they hadn't asked for. He didn't leave Coppervale. He rented a room above the hardware store, 2 streets from the cottage, stripped of everything that once defined him. No guards, no calls at odd hours, no reminders of the empire still operating in his absence. The most powerful man in 4 states now woke early, walked to the greenhouse, and asked Dagny if anything needed carrying. Dagny gave him work without giving him trust. He accepted this without complaint, moving crates of soil, repairing the stone wall, replacing cracked glass panels. His hands learned to carry seedlings without breaking their roots. Vesna watched all of it. She did not approach him immediately. She studied him first, collecting information before making a decision. Then one morning, without ceremony, she walked to where he was stacking clay pots near the greenhouse entrance and stood directly in front of him. "You're very tall," she said. He looked down at her, and something in his face opened in a way that Savannah, watching from behind the glass panels, felt in her chest like a physical blow. "I am," he said. "Can you see the top of the mountains from up there?" "Almost." She held out a small potted marigold with dirt clinging to the roots. "This one didn't grow right. Dagny says it needs more sun." You can have it. He took the pot from her hands carefully, like it was the most valuable thing he had ever been given. And watching through the clouded glass, Sovana understood something she had been fighting since the night he told her the truth. He was not leaving, and Vesna was already letting him in. The day everything changed started like any other. Morning light, greenhouse doors open, Vesna playing near the stone wall while Savannah worked inside and Hadion repaired fencing along the back property. The scream reached all three of them at the same time. Savannah dropped what she was holding and ran. The stone wall, the low one Vesna had been told 100 times not to climb, was exactly the kind of thing a 4-year-old treats as a challenge rather than a boundary. She had fallen on the other side into the drainage ditch along the road, and the sound she was making was not crying. It was silence, the kind that comes from a child who has had the wind knocked out of her and cannot understand why her body will not respond. Sovana reached the wall and saw her daughter lying in the shallow ditch, eyes wide, mouth open, and no sound coming out. Panic hit her like a wave. Then he was there, not crashing through the moment with force, moving with a sureness that cut through her panic like something solid pushed into rushing current. He was over the wall before she could speak, his hands finding Vesna with a gentleness that didn't match anything the world had ever known about him. He lifted her carefully, cradling her against his chest while her small body heaved once, twice, then finally pulled in a ragged, desperate breath that sounded like the loudest thing Sovana had ever heard. Vesna's hands gripped his coat, her fingers twisting into the fabric the same way they had gripped Sovana's shirt the night she was born. And she held on. He spoke to her in a low, even tone. Not words meant to be understood by anyone else. Just presence, certain and unhurried, a calm that wrapped around the child like something that had always been waiting to be needed. Vesna's breathing slowed, her grip loosened just slightly, and then, in a voice still shaking from the fall, she said something that broke every remaining wall Sovana had left. "Don't put me down." He didn't. Sovana stood on the other side of the wall, hands trembling, watching the man she had run from hold her daughter like she was the only thing in the world worth protecting. And she realized that this was what had been taken from them. Not just years, not just truth, but this. The moments where someone else carries the weight. That evening, after Vesna was asleep with a bandage on her elbow and dirt still caught in her hair, Sovana walked onto the porch. He was sitting on the steps. She sat beside him, not across from him, beside him. "I can't keep doing this alone," she said. Her voice was softer than it had been in 4 years. "I built everything around being strong enough by myself. But I'm tired, Hadion. I'm tired, and she deserves more than just surviving." He didn't interrupt. He didn't try to fix it with promises. "I don't know how to trust you. But I know what I saw today. And I know she held on to you like you were the safest place she has ever been." He turned to look at her. Not with the sharpness the world knew. With something stripped bare. Something that had no armor remaining. "I'm not asking you to trust me," he said. "I'm asking you to let me stay long enough to earn it." The simplicity of it settled into her like rain into dry ground. No grand declaration, no demand for forgiveness. Just the most honest thing either of them had said since the night the lights went out and she knelt beside a bleeding stranger on her kitchen floor. She looked out at the garden, at the lavender she had planted the first spring after Vesna was born, at the town that had given her shelter the same way she had once given it to him. Then she leaned into him, just slightly, just enough. And he stayed perfectly still, as if any movement might break whatever fragile thing had just been allowed to exist between them. There was no grand moment, no declaration that drew a line between what had been and what would come next. Just a series of small, deliberate choices that accumulated like mornings, one after another, until they became something that could not be taken back. He stayed through spring, then summer. The room above the hardware store never fully became home because home, for him, was wherever Vesna's voice carried from. She let him into their life the way seasons change. Not all at once, but with a progress that eventually makes the old landscape unrecognizable. Morning walks to the greenhouse, Vesna between them, her small hands reaching for both of theirs like she was building a bridge with her own body. Evenings on the porch, where conversation slowly replaced silence, and silence itself grew comfortable rather than guarded. He did not pretend the past didn't exist. He carried it openly, the way you carry a scar that still aches when the weather turns, and she did not pretend that trust had been fully restored. She carried her caution the same way, visible, honest, part of who she had become. But somewhere between the carrying and the walking and the mornings where Vesna brought them both marigolds she had grown herself, something took root that neither of them had planned for. It did not look like forgiveness. It looked like choosing, every single day, to build something new on ground that had once been burned. The ceremony happened in the greenhouse on an afternoon in early autumn. Dagny closed the shop and arranged chairs between the rows of seedlings. The hardware store owner came, the woman from the clinic. A handful of people who had watched from a respectful distance as two fractured lives slowly learned to share the same space. Vesna stood between them, holding a marigold in one hand and his coat sleeve in the other, looking up at both of them with those green eyes that had started everything and understood more than anyone would ever fully know. He did not speak as a man reclaiming something that had been taken. He spoke as someone asking to be allowed into a life he knew he had not earned, and she did not answer because the past had been erased. She answered because what they could grow together, carefully, honestly, with the patience of people who understood exactly how much it cost to begin again, was stronger than what had been broken. In the end, it was not about power. It was not about empires or territories or the name that still made entire cities fall silent. It was about a blackout and a door that opened when it didn't have to. It was about a woman who chose kindness when fear would have been easier, and a man who spent 4 years learning that the most important thing he would ever do was not the empire he had built, or the enemies he had buried, or the control he had held over everything within his reach. It was the night he bled on a stranger's floor, and she knelt beside him, and the world went dark, and for the first time in his life someone saw him without the power and helped him anyway. That was the thing he could never repay. That was the thing he would spend the rest of his life trying to deserve.